A person spends their entire life searching for possibilities, but in doing so, they often forget that they were born with infinite potential. If you've ever noticed, a young child possesses the passion to grasp the whole world in their little hands. They harbor no fear of any goal and are driven by the enthusiasm to achieve whatever they desire. The child who once seemed capable of achieving anything reaches a point where they settle for whatever comes their way. They start thinking, the time to live life is gone. Now, it's just about getting through it. Such thoughts take over their mind, and this mental trap eats away at their limitless potential, like termites hollowing out wood over time. To understand this mental trap, let me share a story about a camel. But before you get engrossed in the story, make sure to subscribe to this channel. Once upon a time, a merchant owned 50 camels, which he used to travel through the desert for trade. After a long journey across the desert, he stopped at an inn to rest. By this time, the sun had set, and darkness posed a challenge for him. Wherever the merchant stopped during his travels, he would drive stakes into the sandy ground to tether the camels. That night, however, the merchant faced an even bigger problem. He had lost the stake for the 50th camel. He worried that this camel might wander far into the desert, separating from the herd. The merchant was too exhausted from the long journey to stay awake and keep watch. An elderly caretaker at the inn, observing the merchant's dilemma, approached him and said, "If you want to keep your camel with the herd overnight, drive an imaginary stake into the sand and pretend to tie it. In the dark, the camel won't realize it's not real and will believe it's tied. It will stay put all night." Surprised, the merchant asked, "Can this really work? Will the camel stay tethered to an imaginary stake?" The elderly man smiled and said, "I've seen humans tied to imaginary stakes. This is just a camel." Following the man's advice, the merchant pretended to hammer a stake into the ground, creating the sound of hammering and mimicking the act of tying the camel. Believing it was tied, the camel stayed put the entire night. The next morning, the merchant prepared to leave. He untied the 49 camels, but the 50th one refused to move. The merchant was puzzled. How could he untie a stake that didn't exist? Despite his efforts to push and prod the camel, it wouldn't budge. Finally, the merchant sought advice from the elderly man again. The man said, "Just as you pretended to tie the camel, now pretend to untie it. Only then will the camel believe it's free to move." The merchant followed the advice, pretending to remove the stake and untie the rope. To his amazement, the camel stood up and followed the rest of the herd. This isn't just a story. It reflects the state of our minds. We are bound by countless imaginary stakes. Until we recognize and remove these mental stakes, we can never realize our infinite potential. These stakes are nothing but our imaginary fears, our baseless anxieties and doubts that grip our minds so tightly that we begin to question our own abilities. These fears erode our imagination and creativity. Don't just take my word for it. Examine yourself. Dive deep within and see what kind of fears or stakes are holding you back. Reflect on how these stakes are influencing your life. If you look closely, you'll realize that every decision you make or goal you set is confined within a limited boundary. Friends, choosing a goal requires careful thought. But where does this clarity come from? It comes from the same mind that's tied down by countless fears, doubts, and desires. Before setting a goal, it's essential to understand these stakes in your mind. When you truly see them for what they are, they dissolve on their own. These fears and doubts are illusions, mere mirages in the desert of your thoughts. Once the mind is free, thank you for listening with such love. I bow to the divine within you. I'll see you again with another story. Until then, take care of yourself.